For 25 straight years, Gonzaga has made the NCAA tournament, including 9 straight Sweet 16 appearances. Is this the year that title finally comes to Spokane?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, for today, and you're joining at the place to get your college basketball content 5 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year. Want to give a special shout out to our everyday listeners and to those of you who have joined us on our Discord channel. If you have not done so yet, it is free to join. There's a link in the show notes on audio and video platforms. Come hang out. We're talking college hoops all the time. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Ultimate GM. Folks, the Ultimate College Football Head Coach is a brand new mobile game that is completely free, has no ads, and is 100% playable offline. Use the promo code LOCKEDONCFB, all caps, inside the game store to receive a free boost to your program. Begin your coaching legacy today. All right, folks, we are continuing our series doing team previews. Last year, we did all conference previews, and we're still going to do the conference previews this year as well. But we wanted to do some team previews this year as well, specifically looking at the top 25 or teams we expect to be in the top 25 and giving a recap of their offseason, the roster moves that were made. First of all, how their season finished last year, then taking a look at who they lost, who they brought in, what their starting lineup, their rotation might look like, close the show talking about their schedule, their non-conference and conference slates, and how we think they're overall going to do when they get into the NCAA tournament. We did an episode last week with Lance Daw of Locked On Kentucky talking about the Wildcats. Isaac Knight did a show on Monday talking about Kansas, the Jayhawks, to Kansas, a team expected to be in the top 5. We'll see if Kentucky ends up preseason ranked or not. I think they'll probably be in the tail end of the top 25. But for today, we are doing the third show in this series, talking about the Gonzaga Bulldogs, Mark Few's team, certainly going to be a top 10 team when the rankings come out in October, probably, or at least possibly a top 5 team is kind of the expectation. And as we said, they made their Sweet 16 yet again last year. It was the 9th consecutive season for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs, an incredible accomplishment. You can talk about making the NCAA tournament as many years in a row as they have, and there's no doubt that that is an exceptional accomplishment as well. People will point to the conference, the competitive level of the WCC, ignoring the fact that when this started 25 years ago, Gonzaga wasn't any better than those teams, and they have consistently maintained the ability to be the NCAA tournament team coming out of the WCC to the point now where even if they don't win the WCC, they still get a bid in March. It's an incredible accomplishment for a very small school in Spokane, Washington. But last year in particular really looked like it was going to be the end of the streak, not just the Sweet 16 streak, but a lot of people were concerned after losses early in the season to Washington in the non-conference slate. They lost to San Diego State at home. They lost to Santa Clara on the road early in conference play. And there was some real concern that if Gonzaga doesn't find a way to beat St. Mary's and get that automatic bid, that they could get left out of the big dance. Of course, that did not end up happening. Gonzaga blew their way through the rest of the WCC slate, ended up securing a 5 seed in the NCAA tournament, took down McNeese, a trendy upset pick for many people. Gonzaga blew the doors off them in their first round game and then took it to Kansas, a depleted, injured Kansas team in the second round. That's how Gonzaga advanced to the Sweet 16 yet again, where they fell to Purdue, who of course made it all the way to the national championship game. But part of the reason there's a lot more excitement and intrigue and expectation for Gonzaga heading into the next season is that they pretty much kept that entire core around. And yes, it was a core that struggled early in the year, but part of those early season struggles, I think, can be chalked up to losing Steele Venters 2 days before the season started and having to make a last-minute adjustment to your starting lineup, starting a true freshman in Dusty Stromer, and just lack of continuity. Graham Ike was new to the system, new to the team as the starting center. Ryan Nembhard, new to the system, new to the team as the starting point guard. This year, that won't be the case. Ryan Nembhard's back. Graham Ike is back. In fact, everybody who was a key contributor for Gonzaga last year, 7 of their 8 leading scorers are back. in the mix for the 2024-25 season. The only key contributor who is not going to be back for Gonzaga is Anton Watson. Anton Watson played his 5th and final season of college basketball last year for the Zags, averaged about 14 points a game, had his best offensive season, has been an excellent defensive player for the last half decade, ended up getting selected 54th overall by the Boston Celtics in the draft. He is the key loss for Gonzaga. They do also lose Pavle Stosic and Luka Krajinovic, who were both scholarship players Gonzaga signed very late last offseason. Both players entered the transfer portal. Stosic transferred to Utah State. Krajinovic went back home to Croatia. Both players were kind of encouraged by the Gonzaga staff to enter the transfer portal because they had some key pieces that they wanted to add in the transfer portal and needed to clear up some scholarship room to do so. Again, everybody else is back. Nembhard's back, Hickman's back, Ben Gregg is back, Graham Ike is back, Braden Huff is back, Dusty Stromer is back as well. Those 6 players represent a huge chunk of the minutes that are going to be played for Gonzaga this upcoming season. They also add a trio of transfers who are expected to make, 2 of them in particular, who are expected to make a big impact right away for Gonzaga. Number 1 is Michael Ajayi. Michael Ajayi transfers to Gonzaga from Pepperdine, a intra-conference transfer from a bottom feeder in the WCC up to the top. Ajayi is from Kent, Washington, played junior college basketball for 2 years, played his first season of Division I basketball last year for the Waves, and all he managed to do was lead the WCC in scoring at 17.2 points per game, lead the conference in rebounding at 9.9 rebounds per game, and shoot 47% from 3. It was a low volume of attempts, but that is still a remarkable statistical accomplishment for Ajayi in his first season of D1 basketball. He entered the draft process, didn't pull out of the draft until the last possible day, but had committed to Gonzaga in the portal long before that. He's expected to replicate to replace Anton Watson in the starting lineup. Not exactly the same player, a bit more offensive versatility, a little bit less expected from him defensively, but a fantastic player nonetheless. I project he will be the only non-returner in the starting lineup for Gonzaga because I think Khalif Battle is going to come off the bench. Battle's played 100 plus college basketball games in his career, played at Butler, played at Temple, played last year at Arkansas. He started about 30% of the games he has played, so he's very comfortable and familiar coming off the bench. I think he's going to serve a role that Gonzaga didn't really have last year as a 6th man, coming off the bench immediately, kind of microwave scorer type. Averaged about 15 a game last year for the Hogs, about 3 boards. He is a prolific rim pressure player. He loves getting to the rim, loves getting to the free throw line. Took just about 7 free throw attempts per game last year, was about 87%. The stat that I love, Khalif Battle made 50 more free throws than Graham Ike attempted last year. Graham Ike led Gonzaga in free throw attempts, and Khalif Battle made 50 more than Graham Ike attempted. This was not an area that Gonzaga had a lot of success last year, and they brought in a player who's going to bring that in a major way for them. Their other addition is Emmanuel Innocenti, transfer from Tarleton State. He was a freshman last year, all-WAC freshman contributor. He is initially from Italy. Averaged about 6.5 points and 6.5 rebounds last year. Also averaged just under 3 assists per game. I kind of expect him to be outside the rotation. We'll talk more lineup and rotation here in the second segment, but still a young player that has some upside, particularly on the defensive end of the floor. And what I really liked about this offseason for Mark Few and the Zags is, yeah, they're going for it right now. Don't get me wrong. Mark Few got his gold medal with Team USA. He wants to bring home a trophy as well. They are all in on winning this thing in 24-25, but they made some additions to help them in the future as well. We see a lot of coaches right now who are, I want to fill 10 or 11 scholarship spots, maybe 12, but I'm not going to fill all 13. I don't want to be developing somebody who's going to transfer somewhere else. Mark Few did not adopt that policy. They did fill all 13 scholarships. They filled one of them with Braeden Smith, the Patriot League Player of the Year, transfer from Colgate, initially from Seattle. And the crazy thing about Braeden Smith, the guy averaged 12.5 points, over 5 boards, over 5 assists, 2 steals per game last year in the Patriot League. He could have transferred to a whole bunch of different places, but he comes to Gonzaga with the intention to redshirt, sit out this upcoming season, and then step in as Gonzaga's starting point guard the following year when both Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman are out of eligibility. The fact that Gonzaga was able to convince him to come to Gonzaga, to Spokane, to sit out for a year and develop behind the scenes is just a tremendous testament to Mark Few's recruiting ability and the belief that these players have in this program. Lastly, Ismaila Diagne is a the only incoming freshman on Gonzaga's roster in the 2024 class. They landed him very recently, just a few months ago. He is a young man from Spain. He's been playing with in the Real Madrid Youth League for a long time. I was one of the youngest players to ever play in the Euro League at the top level. He's a rim protector. He's a very young, very energetic, big, who could develop significantly in Gonzaga's system. Would expect very little playing time from him this year, but the kind of raw, high upside potential that you'd love to have with one of your final scholarship spots on the year. Well, the Zags have more depth than usual. Mark Few, kind of like Bill Self, he doesn't play very many guys every game. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out. And we're going to talk about that. How are the pieces going to fit together in Spokane? And how does the recent re-injury for Steele Venters, who will now miss his second straight season, how does that impact this team's overall ceiling? We got all that and more coming up in just a second. Hey, Locked On College Basketball fans, I want to take a moment to give you a heads up on a brand new mobile game that I think you are going to love. Ultimate College Football Head Coach. In this amazing simulation, you get to step into the shoes of a head coach and lead your college football program to glory. Can you imagine actually being the head coach of your favorite program? Whether it's recruiting players, hiring coaching staff, to overseeing training camps and handling school scholarships, you control every crucial detail of your program. Are you going to be able to handle the pressure? Here's what I really love about this game. You are responsible for calling offensive plays, so your strategy will not only determine the success of your football season, but will shape the future and legacy of your program. Ultimate College Football Head Coach is completely free. It has no ads, and it is 100% playable offline. So you can play on the go whenever and wherever you want. And of course, we have a special offer for our Locked On College Basketball fans. Use promo code LOCKEDONCFB, all caps, inside the game store, and you'll receive a free boost to your program. To download the game, just visit ultimate-cfb.com or look it up on the Google or Apple app stores. Ultimate College Football Head Coach. Begin your coaching legacy today. All right, folks, segment 2. Still Andy Patton, still listening to the Locked On College Basketball podcast, and you are still listening to our third in what we expect to be 20-ish, maybe 30-ish different team previews as we get ready for the 2024-25 college basketball season. I know football is what's just coming back, but football being back is a sign that basketball is following suit. Very excited for this season, a little under 9 weeks away as we record right now. And folks, want to continue to talk about this Gonzaga Bulldogs basketball team. Program that is consistently in the Sweet 16, that has made the national championship game 2 times in the last 7 years, and that has the roster makeup and construction to potentially be back in that conversation once again. We're going to close the show talking a little bit more about this team's ceiling, their schedule, things like that. But what I want to do now is take a look at this roster, the things that have changed, the things that have not changed, and how Mark Few might divide up the minutes, put all the pieces together. And the conversation starts with something that I know my co-host Isaac talked about last week that many of you who are following the Zags probably are already aware of. Steele Venters, transfer from Eastern Washington, who joined the team last offseason right around the same time as both Ryan Nembhard and Graham Ike. Venters unfortunately missed his first season at Gonzaga with a torn ACL in his knee, suffered 2 days before Gonzaga's season opener at home against Yale. He was on the road to recovery, had been doing some light scrimmage work, some shooting drills. The expectation was he'd be able to get into some 5-on-5 stuff in September, potentially be able to rejoin the team right around the start of the year. It wasn't clear whether he was going to be full speed 100% at the start of this upcoming season. But now, unfortunately, he is not going to be able to play once again, a second straight season completely down the drain for Steele Venters. This time he suffered an Achilles injury. We don't know the full extent of the Achilles injury, but he has had surgery on the injury and is expected to once again miss an entire year. Venters redshirted his first year at Eastern Washington, played 3 years at Eastern Washington, and has now spent 2 years on the bench for Gonzaga. So this is a young man who's been in college for a very long time. He still does have 2 years of eligibility after this year, should he choose to use them. At this point, at this recording, it is unclear whether Venters what his plan is. All assumptions right now in Spokane are that he is going to rehab and get himself back and be prepared to play for Gonzaga in the 25-26 season. But it depends on how those things go. If he has a change of heart, there's a lot of factors at play. But ultimately for Gonzaga, this is a tough loss. They're more equipped to handle losing Steele Venters than they were last year when they thrust freshman Dusty Stromer into the starting lineup, ultimately switched the starting lineup about halfway through the year to add Ben Gregg to the starting lineup, have Anton Watson play more of the 3, and have Dusty Stromer come off the bench. This year, however, Steele Venters probably wasn't going to start. In fact, I had projected him to be just outside the rotation before he got hurt, which means that my rotation projections for Gonzaga didn't actually change that much. Mark Few barely plays 8. If he could play 7 every game, I think that he would. Usually there's kind of an 8th person borderline in the rotation. 9th person is usually not somebody in the rotation. And looking at this Gonzaga team before Venters was hurt, somebody was going to be left out of playing time. Now with Venters hurt, it's a little bit easier to kind of see who the top 8 are going to be. My projected starting lineup for Gonzaga this upcoming season is Graham Ike at the 5, Ben Gregg at the 4, Michael Ajayi at the 3, Nolan Hickman and Ryan Nembhard, the 2 guards. There are a couple different things they could do with this starting lineup. It's possible Ben Gregg goes back to the bench. Michael Ajayi, instead of playing the 3, plays the 4, and they play a 3-guard lineup with Khalif Battle starting. I would be not stunned or anything, but I'd be fairly surprised, mostly because I don't think there's ever been a time, at least in my time following Gonzaga, where Mark Few, a player, has been a bench player for multiple years, gotten to the point where they earn a starting spot, play well as a starter, and then in their final season, their senior season, get relegated back to the bench. That would be unusual. So I think Ben Gregg is pretty well safe with the starting spot. There's no way Graham Ike, Nolan Hickman, and Ryan Nembhard don't start. So if Ben Gregg's also locked into a starting spot, then that means that final spot is either Michael Ajayi playing the 3. It could be Khalif Battle with Ajayi coming off the bench, although again, that would kind of surprise me. I think Ajayi is more tailor-made to that starting spot, whereas Battle, again, is very comfortable coming off the bench. Either way, those 6 guys locked into rotation spots. Whether Battle starts or comes off the bench, it doesn't really matter. Those 6 players are key contributors for Mark Few and the Zags next year. And then the big hinge for Gonzaga, if they are going to win a championship, the 2 other players in the rotation need to take big sophomore leaps. That is Dusty Stromer, who is a true sophomore heading into his 2nd season after starting half the year last year as a freshman. And then Braden Huff, who is a redshirt sophomore. He redshirted his freshman year. And then last year was his first season playing for Gonzaga. And he was an immediately impactful player coming off the bench, led Gonzaga in scoring in like 3 of his first few games in a Gonzaga uniform. He literally looked like Drew Timme 2.0 coming off the bench, scoring around the rim effortlessly. He's got a little bit more of an outside shot. He's got issues defensively, which also kind of works with the Drew Timme comparison. He's got some issues handling the basketball, which is something he needs to clean up. But Braden Huff looks like a potential future star for Gonzaga. If he continues to develop, if Dusty Stromer, who shot 32% from 3 in the first half of the year and 41% in the second half, if Dusty Stromer is that kind of 3-point shooter, a 3-and-D wing as your 8th man, and you have a potentially dominant low post starting center as your 7th man, and a guy who averaged 29.5 points per game in his final 7 games in the SEC last year as your 6th man in Khalif Battle, boy, this is a team that's got a lot of depth, a lot of talent. We haven't even gotten into the other players on Gonzaga's roster. Emmanuel Innocenti, we mentioned him earlier, the transfer from Tarleton State, a 6'5" guard, 2-3 hybrid, who's a very good defensive player. They have Jun Seok Yeo back in the mix. Yeo is from South Korea, joined the team 2 years ago in the middle of the season, did not play, played a little bit last year, kind of was expecting to play a bit more, but he looked pretty raw. We'll see if he gets much playing time this year. I suspect that he probably will not, just with the amount of depth this team has. And then you have Ismaila Diagne, who we mentioned earlier, the incoming freshman from Spain, who I expect is going to do most of his development this year. behind the scenes. So that's how this is kind of shaken out for Gonzaga. I think you're going to see a lot of Nolan Hickman and Ryan Nembhard. Those two guys played about 35 minutes a game each last year. This year, I expect somewhat similar. You'll see a lot of 3-guard lineups with Khalif Battle on the floor alongside Nembhard and Hickman. The Zags could go really small and play Michael Ajayi at the 4 with Ben Gregg at the 5. That's a lineup that has a ton of floor spacing. All of those guys can shoot, can knock down the open 3. They can get out in transition. They're going to be a little bit limited defensively, but you also have Graham Ike and Braden Huff, bigger bodied guys who are not exactly rim protectors, but are at least capable of snatching defensive rebounds and making life a little bit difficult for those guys in the front court. So lots of different options for Gonzaga, lots of different ways that this thing might shake out. Again, last year, the loss of Steele Venters really curtailed their season. It's incredibly unfortunate for Steele and for Gonzaga that it has happened again, but the fact that it is not nearly as detrimental is proof of how hard Mark Few and this staff worked to bring in the kind of depth necessary to withstand that kind of departure and still be a team that is in contention for national championship. And that's what I want to talk about to close out the show. This team has an incredibly competitive non-conference schedule. Mark Few lives up to the mantra, anytime, anywhere, anybody. He is not afraid to play you. This team has a really competitive schedule, and this might be the year that everything comes together for Mark Few and the Zags, and they end up carrying home a trophy less than a year after Mark Few gets his Olympic gold. We're going to talk more about that in just a second. Right after I tell you all about today's sponsor, 5 Hour Energy. Folks, 5 Hour Energy fixes tired fast. When you've got a long list of DIY projects to tackle at home, take a 5 Hour Energy shot so you can check everything off your list. If you're like me, you always have that long list of home projects, so when you get your supplies, don't forget the most essential supply, 5 Hour Energy shot. 5 Hour Energy is the brand hardworking people have trusted for over 20 years to give them the alert, energized feel that they need to get through a busy, hectic day. You always know where to find 5 Hour Energy, right at the cash register at nearly every convenience, drug, and grocery store nationwide. Stock up on money-saving multi-packs to make sure you never run out of delicious, energizing 5 Hour Energy shots. Folks, just go to 5hourenergy.com and get some 5 Hour Energy product today. You can even use my promo code LOCKEDONCFB to receive 20% off your order. That offer is only valid until September 30th on one order and cannot be used with other promotions, and the code is not good on subscription orders. So, folks, go to 5hourenergy.com today. All right, folks, closing out the show, continuing our season preview episode here, talking about Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Like we said, this is the third in this series. We talked Kentucky with Lance Daw, the host of Locked On Kentucky, last week. Isaac and I talked Kansas, the Rock Chalk Jayhawks, on Monday's episode. We're probably going to have two to three of these per week, along with conference previews, as we are getting full speed ahead, getting y'all ready for 9 weeks from now when this college basketball season gets underway. All right, Mark Few and the Zags, they got the talent. They have the combination of roster continuity, returning 4 of 5 starters, adding key talent in the transfer portal. You want to have more than 50% of your minutes back. You want to add significant talent. You want some younger upside guys. You want some guys developing in your system. Check, 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 check. Mark Few and the Zags have all of that after going out and landing some key players in the transfer portal, getting some younger guys to come up through the system. This team is all ready to go. And while one of the prevailing sentiments that has kind of a little bit gone away as folks have maybe realized it wasn't as big of a deal, but one of the long conversations that has always been about Gonzaga is that their conference schedule prevents them from winning a national championship, that they get overseeded in March because they win a bunch of games against teams that aren't in the NCAA tournament, and that they falter when they get farther into the tournament. Now, it takes very little research to look at Gonzaga's record compared to their seed line, compared to expectation, to be able to note that Gonzaga does not lose or choke or struggle in the tournament more than any other high-profile team. They tend to do about as well as their seed line does, with few exceptions, as every team has. That has not generally been the issue. And one of the ways that Mark Few and the Zags have kind of curbed the WCC, because again, as much as I don't think the WCC is dragging Gonzaga down, I'm also not going to sit here and pretend that the WCC is on par with the ACC or the SEC or the Big 12 or the Big 10 or the former Pac 12. It's not. It's not. And I think there's some really good teams in the WCC, but by and large, Gonzaga plays a much easier schedule from January to early March than the other teams that are in contention for a national championship. But Gonzaga plays a tougher schedule from November to December than almost all of those teams. We spend a lot of time on this show kind of dragging or bagging on certain teams that schedule particularly weak non-conference schedules. We've talked about it on the show very recently. There are some great teams that schedule competitively. Kentucky, Kansas, and Duke are all three teams that have really competitive non-conference schedules, despite also having competitive conference slates. So it's not like nobody is doing this, but very few teams do it quite at the level that Mark Few and the Zags do. Right now, it is still unconfirmed, but they are expected to open their season on Wednesday, November 6th against Scott Drew and the Baylor Bears. There's rumors that game may end up happening in Mexico City. But either way, whether it happens there, whether it happens in Vegas, which was the initial rumor, it does sound like it is going to happen. So Baylor will be part of Gonzaga's non-conference schedule, along with San Diego State, who they're playing on the road, a true road game on November 18th. They also play Kentucky at Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle, part of the Battle for Seattle. They also play UConn back-to-back, defending national champion UConn Huskies at the Madison Square Garden on December 14th. They'll play UCLA at the Intuit Dome, which is just outside of Los Angeles, so a pseudo road game for Gonzaga against UCLA. So again, you got UCLA, UConn, Kentucky, San Diego State, and Baylor. They also have Arizona State at the Kennel. I'll mention that one because it's a Big 12 opponent, although they are not. Well, we'll see. We'll see. I don't want to make any assumptions on how Arizona State's going to be this year. They got a lot of new talent, and that's a team that could surprise some folks. Regardless, Baylor, Arizona State, San Diego State, Kentucky, UConn, UCLA. And we haven't even talked about the Battle for Atlantis, where Gonzaga will open against West Virginia. If they defeat West Virginia, they will play either Indiana or Louisville. If they win that game, they will play the winner of the other side of the bracket, which very possibly could be the Arizona Wildcats. It'll either be them or Providence or Oklahoma or Davidson. If it is Arizona, it would be an incredible matchup between Mark Few and Tommy Lloyd. Tommy was the longtime assistant coach at Gonzaga for literally 20 years, 10 years as the associate head coach before he took that head coaching job at Arizona. So we could see the epic matchup between Mark Few and Tommy Lloyd. They haven't played each other since Lloyd took over as the head coach there. But even if we don't, we'll probably get that game. But even if we don't, Gonzaga will get West Virginia, one of Indiana or Louisville, potentially Arizona or somebody else in that group there. This is an incredibly competitive non-conference schedule. Incredibly competitive. It's not done yet. There's still a couple more games to be done. We have some gimme games on here, as you always do. They play Nicholls State at home. They play Bucknell at home. We've heard they're going to play Long Beach State this year as well. There's two more games still to be filled out, maybe just one. Either way, Gonzaga's going for it this year. They're playing the big boys. They're playing the best teams that they can. And yeah, the WCC looks like it's going to be a little weaker. They added Oregon State and Washington State, but frankly, that does not make the WCC stronger, especially with Washington State losing all but one scholarship player from last year's team. Washington State is effectively just Eastern Washington. They bring head coach David Riley from the Eagles to Washington State. He brings, I think, five or six players from Eastern Washington with him. So I'm not sure how good that Washington State team is going to be. I know St. Mary's lost Aiden Mahaney and Joshua Jefferson to UConn and Iowa State, respectively. San Francisco loses their best player, Jonathan Mobo, who goes in the second round of the NBA draft. Santa Clara is going to be good. They kept Adama Ball, a guy that many people thought was going to stay in the draft process. They bring back Carlos Stewart, who transferred to LSU and came back this offseason. So I think Santa Clara is a real contender to finish second or third in the conference. St. Mary's is still going to be good, but they're losing their two best players from last year. So that's going to be certainly tough for them to replicate. So Gonzaga's got a little bit weaker WCC slate. They got a tremendous non-conference schedule, and they have everything else that you need. They have the depth. They have the competitive schedule. They have the experience. They have the high-end talent. They have the coaching. All of that is what you need to put together a team capable of winning a national championship. It's all there. The only question people will have, and I've seen this narrative brought up, does Gonzaga have enough NBA talent to win a national championship? Without having done the eons of research that it would take to determine whether you need NBA talent to win a championship, let's be clear, it helps. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, maybe it doesn't matter at all. I'm sure it helps. Gonzaga's two teams that have been in the national championship. One of them had Jalen Suggs. One of them had Zach Collins. Both of them were one-and-done lottery picks. That's a pretty good proof right there. UConn won championship last year. 4 of their 5 starters are gone in the NBA. 2 of them were in the first 10 picks. That is what happens when you put together a championship caliber team. Most of your guys end up going to the league. Does Gonzaga have a bunch of NBA players on this roster? Probably not. Probably not. Could that be a factor for them? Yeah, absolutely. I think rim protection is an issue for this team in general. I think their three-point shooting is a question now that Steele Venters is hurt. I do think this team has NBA talent. I think Michael Ajayi is going to be an NBA player, a second-round pick this year, but I think he's going to be a guy who makes it into the league. I think there's if Dusty Stromer or Braden Huff break out as sophomores, I think that could really help this team in a major way as well. So this is a team that right now their odds, you look at FanDuel, you look at any other betting spots, you're going to see Gonzaga as one of the teams in the top 5 in terms of odds to win the national championship. People have fatigue. People think, oh, this team's always in this conversation. Are they really going to do it this year? This year's set up as good as they've been in a while. This team is set up to be as good as they've been since 2021 when they ran through everybody, didn't lose a game until they played Baylor in that national championship game. This team is as good as any team they've had since then, is fully capable of putting themselves in that conversation. All right, folks, we got a lot more of these coming your way here in the next couple of weeks. We're going to be talking about every top 25-ish team. We're going to talk about every major conference in college basketball as well. Stick with us here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. We really appreciate you taking your time to listen to these previews as we get you as ready as we can for the 2024-25 college basketball season. As always, apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. Need them to win a few games in Atlantis to set up that Mark Few, Tommy Lloyd matchup. And until Wednesday, as always, peace out.